Daniels happened about 6 years ago when I was stationed at a large army installation somewhere in the southwest. I'm not going to say exactly which one, mostly because some of the training areas I'm talking about are still active. If you've ever spent time on one of those huge desert installations, you probably know how isolated they can get. Once you're several miles beyond the main part of the base, there is almost nothing around you except miles of open land. We had been running a field exercise for 4 days, and by the last night everyone was exhausted and ready to get back. All personnel were supposed to return to our temporary staging area by midnight, but when we did accountability around 12:30, we came up one short. Specialist L. Miller was missing. Nobody panicked immediately because things like that happen during clutch exercises. Radios die, people misunderstand instructions, and sometimes somebody simply ends up waiting at the wrong location. The problem was that Miller had been working near one of the more remote sections of the training area, and nobody had heard him for almost 2 hours. Sergeant Daniels was told to put together a search team and head toward Miller's last location. The team came up together pretty quickly. Daniels brought me and another guy from our platoon named Carter. A medic was sent from another company, and Rage Operations provided an NCO who knew the part of the installation. The important thing is that Daniels hadn't personally selected everyone in the group. People were being sent over from different parts of the exercise, and he wasn't given a roster with every name before we left. That's how Walker got in. He showed up while we were getting our equipment together and said he had been sent to assist with the search. There was nothing obviously wrong with him. He had body armor, a helmet, a rifle, rank insignia, a US Army tape, and a name tape that said Walker. His unit badge was right, and the way he wore his equipment looked completely normal. More importantly, he wasn't the only person there Daniels didn't know. One of us knew the medic personally, and the range NCO had also been sent over separately. In the middle of a large exercise, having unfamiliar soldiers temporarily attached to our group wasn't unusual. Daniels had been told that additional personnel were being sent to help, so when Walker said he was one of them, nobody had any reason to question it. The 6 of us took a Humvee toward Miller's last known location. We drove until the terrain became too rough to continue, left the vehicle, and started moving on foot. Walker acted exactly like everyone else. He understood the terminology, seemed comfortable with the equipment, and spoke like someone who had done this kind of thing before. There was nothing about him that made me think he didn't belong there. We had been walking for around 40 minutes when Walker noticed a glove beside an old dirt surface road. Walker suggested trying an old drainage area further east. There were several large concrete culverts there, and he said Miller might have tried to shelter inside one if he had gotten turned around after dark. The suggestion seemed reasonable. Daniels agreed and we changed direction. About 10 minutes later, the staging area contacted us for an update. Daniels reported that we hadn't found Miller and that we were continuing east. During the conversation, he asked whether anyone else was being sent to reinforce us. The answer was no. Then the person on the other hand mentioned that the medic from other company and the NCO from range operations were the only 2 people who had been attached to Daniels' group. Daniels didn't react immediately. He asked them to confirm it. 1 medic, 1 range NCO, nobody else. I remember watching Daniels look around at us. He already knew me and Carter. That left 3 people he hadn't known before that night: the medic, the range NCO, and Walker. Daniels asked for the names of the 2 men who had officially been sent to us. Both checked out. Walker didn't. Nobody had sent anyone named Walker. That was the moment the entire situation changed. We were miles from the main base in almost complete darkness, walking alongside an armed man who had somehow inserted himself into our search team. His uniform looked correct. His equipment looked correct. He knew how to talk to soldiers, and he knew enough about the training area to suggest where we should search, but nobody knew who he was. Daniels didn't confront him. Instead, he gradually moved Carter closer to Walker while the rest of us continued walking. I think Walker noticed that something had changed because he became quieter. Earlier he had been making suggestions and talking normally, but after that he mostly stayed toward the back. A few minutes later he suggested splitting into two smaller groups to cover more ground. Daniels refused and said we would stay together until Miller was located. Walker didn't argue. We eventually reached a dry wash that was difficult to cross in the dark. Everyone was focused on watching their footing, and for less than a minute our attention was on the ground instead of each other. When we reached the other side, Carter noticed Walker was done. There was no sound of somebody running and no obvious movement behind us. We searched the wash with our lights, but couldn't see him anywhere. Daniels immediately pulled everyone together and reported what had happened. At that point, we had two problems. Miller was still missing, and there was now an identified armed man somewhere in the same training area. A few minutes later, Miller finally managed to reach us over the radio. His transmission was weak, but he was able to describe a concrete drainage pipe beside an old service road. The range NCO recognized location and we reached it about 20 minutes later. Miller was inside. His wrist had been tied with plastic cord, he had a cut above one eye, and he was badly dehydrated, but otherwise he was okay. Once he had recovered enough to explain what happened, he told us that earlier that evening he had noticed someone near an old maintenance area where nobody was supposed to be. When he went over to investigate, he found several boxes containing military equipment. Before he could report it, somebody attacked him from behind. He never got a clear look at the man's face. Military police looked down the nearby training sectors and searched the area through the night. Our Humvee was checked. Abandoned structures were cleared and investigators took over the location where Miller had discovered the equipment. They found the box he had described, along with food, water, batteries, pieces of military clothing, and other supplies. From what we were later told, someone appeared to have been using abandoned structures around the training area for quite some time. But they didn't find Walker. The strangest detail involved the glove. Miller told investigators that he had still been wearing both gloves when he was attacked. When we found him, one was missing. That meant the glove Walker had supposedly discovered beside the service road hadn't fallen there by accident. Someone had taken it from Miller and placed it there. The obvious theory was that Walker had joined our search specifically to control where we looked. He planted the glove and then suggested moving east, farther away from the place where Miller was actually being held. During the investigation, we gave military police the name we had seen on his uniform, Walker. It led nowhere. Nobody by that time matching our description was assigned to any of the units involved in the exercise. Investigators also found military clothing among the supplies, including an old OCP top with the name tape removed and several loose unit badges. They never found the Walker name tape. That bothered me because everything about him had looked right. His uniform, rank, badges, equipment, and even the way he carried himself seemed completely natural. Whoever he was, he had simply found an army uniform and put it on. He knew how a soldier was supposed to look and act. As far as I know, they never found him. I've never heard about an arrest and nobody ever told us that investigators had identified. I never heard about an arrest and nobody ever told us that investigators had identified a suspect. Some people thought he had previously served in the army. Others thought he might have been a former contractor who knew the installation and had learned our procedures. A few guys believed he had been living somewhere in the training area and stealing equipment for months. Those were only theories. To this day, I don't know who Walker really was, where he went after disappearing into that wash, or what he had actually been doing on the installation. What bothers me most is how easily he became a part of our group. For almost an hour, he walked beside us, carried a rifle, gave us directions, and helped us search for a man he may have attacked himself. We eventually figured out that Walker had been leading us away from Miller. What we never figured out was where he was trying to take us. If the radio call had come 10 minutes later, we probably would have kept following him east. And sometimes, I still wonder what we would have found out there. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was serving as a combat engineer at a large army installation in the western United States. Our company was supporting a training exercise, and my team had been assigned to inspect the route that the heavy convoy would use the following morning. There were 4 of us, and it was one of those jobs you barely think about while you're doing it. We checked sections of road, drainage areas, and a few older structures to make sure nothing would cause problem for the vehicles coming through. By late afternoon, we had one stop left. It was an old concrete bridge over a mostly dry creek bed, several miles from the nearest public road. Harris, another guy from my team, climbed down with me to inspect the supports while the others who stayed near our Humvee. We weren't under there for more than a minute when Harris pointed out a sleeping bag tucked behind one of the concrete columns. There were bottles of water, canned food, packaged snacks, and a small propane stove beside it. My first thought was that somebody had been sleeping there. That alone was strange. We were well inside the restricted training area, nowhere near a place a civilian could reasonably wander into by accident. Then Harris found a camera. It was stored in a protective case with a long telephoto lens attached. I remember looking at Harris and realizing we're both thinking the same thing. This wasn't just somebody looking for a place to sleep. There was a waterproof bag pushed farther behind the support. Inside were several plastic folders filled with printed photographs. Most of them showed military vehicles. Humvees, transport trucks, fuel vehicles, convoy, and soldiers moving through different parts of the installation. Some had clearly been taken from public roads outside the base, which was odd but not necessarily alarming. Then we started seeing locations I recognized from inside the training area. Places civilians had no reason to be. There were photographs of vehicles at temporary staging sites, soldiers walking near equipment, and rows deep enough inside the installation that you would need to know exactly where you were going to reach them. Several of the pictures had dates written on the back. Whoever had taken them had been doing it for months. Then Harris stopped going through the folder. He handed me a photograph without saying anything. It showed our Humvee. The picture had been taken early that morning as we were leaving for the inspection. The next one showed us at a checkpoint several miles away. I could actually recognize Harris standing beside the vehicle. Then I found another photograph underneath it. That one had been taken less than an hour earlier. Our Humvee was driving toward the bridge. The photograph had been taken from somewhere above the road, probably one of the ridges we had passed on the way in. I remember immediately looking out from underneath the bridge toward the hills. Up until that moment, the training area had felt completely empty. Suddenly it didn't. Somebody had watched us leave that morning, followed our movement through the installation, and photographed us on the way to the exact place where we had just found his camp. We contacted range control. Once we explained the photographs, they told us to stop touching anything and stay where we were. Military police were being sent to our location. That meant waiting. And that was when I started thinking about something I really didn't like. If the last photograph was less than an hour old, whoever had taken it probably hadn't gone far. The 4 of us moved above the bridge and stayed near the Humvee. None of us suggested searching the surrounding area. We had no idea who we were dealing with, whether he was armed or whether there was more than one person out there. For the first 10 or 15 minutes, nothing happened. Then Harris noted a brief flash on one of the ridges several hundred yards away. It looked like sunlight reflecting off glass. We watched the area with binoculars. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then a figure moved between 2 rocks. It was too far away to make out a face or even what the person was wearing, but I could tell he was standing still and facing our direction. We were looking at him, and he was looking at us. A few seconds later, he moved behind the ridge. That was the first moment I felt genuinely afraid. Finding the camp was unsettling. Finding our photograph was worse. But seeing someone still out there meant this wasn't something he had abandoned days ago. He knew we'd found it. We reported the sighting and were told again to stay where we were. A few minutes later, one of the guys walked around the back of the Humvee, called us over. There were boot prints in the loose dirt. They came from the direction of the creek bed, approached the passenger side of the vehicle and then headed back toward the ground. Maybe they had been there before we arrived. We couldn't prove otherwise. But none of us remembered seeing them. They were fresh. Then while Harris and I were underneath the bridge going through the photographs, somebody had walked close enough to our Humvee to touch it. That thought bothered me more than seeing him on the ridge. We checked the vehicle, but nothing seemed to be missing or damaged. From that point on, none of us really talked. We just watched the hills and waited for the MPs. Then we heard an engine. A civilian SUV appeared on a service road about half a mile away. It wasn't speeding at first. It moved normally until it reached a better road leading toward the edge of the training area. Then it accelerated. We reported the vehicle in its direction immediately. Military police didn't come flying past us after it. They coordinated with personnel closer to the exit, and a few minutes later we were told the SUV had been stopped before reaching a public road. The driver was detained. By the time the MPs reached the bridge, the sun was going down. They secured the camp, photographed everything, and took our statements. Over the next few days, pieces of the story started getting back to us. The man they had detained was an American civilian who had previously worked for a contractor on the installation. They explained how he knew the road network and how it managed to move through parts of the training area without immediately getting lost. Investigators also connected him to several thefts of military tools and equipment over the previous months. The explanation we were given was actually pretty simple. The photographs weren't valuable by themselves. He was using them to track unit movement. If he knew where people were training, he also knew which storage areas, temporary work sites, and equipment locations were likely to be untended. It was some elaborate espionage operation. As far as we knew, he was a thief who had figured out a very effective way to choose his opportunities. He was eventually turned over to the appropriate authorities and charged in connections with trespassing and theft. That should have ended the whole thing. It didn't. Within days, people started coming up with their own versions. Some soldiers were convinced the theft's explanations was only part of the story. Others said he had been selling information or photographs of military movements. One guy swore federal agents had taken over the investigation. The rumor heard most often was that he hadn't been working alone. According to that version, there were other hidden observation sites around the training area, and possibly other people using them. I never saw anything proving that, but I understood why people believed it. Photographs under the bridge had been taken from different locations over a period of months, and some of those locations were miles apart. So the bridge definitely wasn't the only place he'd been watching from. People eventually started calling him the range ghost. Any strange light on a ridge became a joke about him. And any civilian vehicle near the training area supposedly belonged to one of his parents. Personally, I think the official explanation was probably the right one. He was most likely just a thief who knew the installation unusually well, in a way that was more disturbing to me than the rumors. He hadn't needed anything sophisticated. He had a camera, some places to hide, and enough patience to learn our routines. A month, soldiers had been driving through those areas assuming there was nobody around except the people participating in the exercises. Meanwhile, somebody had been sitting on ridges underneath bridges and near old roads watching them through a telephoto lens. After that day, Empty training areas never really felt empty to me again. I started checking ridge lines without thinking about it. I looked at the windows of abandoned buildings whenever we passed, and every time we crossed an old bridge, I found myself wondering whether someone might be sitting underneath it. We didn't catch that man because we were looking for him. We weren't conducting a security sweep or investigating anything suspicious. We were four engineers doing a routine inspection on an ordinary afternoon, and the only reason anyone discovered what we had been doing for months was because Harris and I happened to look underneath the right bridge. For most of the time I worked Army logistics, civilian trucks were just background noise. There were so many of them coming through that after a while you barely noticed. Contractors moved between buildings, trailers were dropped and picked up, containers came and went, and drivers you had never seen before would show up with paperwork and ask where they needed to go. That was why I didn't think much about the driver when he pulled into our loading area one afternoon. I was working logistics at a large army installation in the United States at the time. It was maybe an hour before the end of our shift when a civilian tractor trailer arrived carrying a standard shipping container. The driver looked very completely ordinary, probably somewhere in his 40s, work clothes, reflective vest and clipboard. More importantly, his company wasn't unfamiliar to us. We'd seen their trucks on the installation before, and as far as we knew, he'd already gone through whatever checks were required to get through the gate. He dropped the container and came over to ask me how to reach another warehouse farther inside the installation. I gave him directions. He thanked me, climbed back into his truck and drove away. The entire conversation probably lasted 30 seconds. About 20 minutes later, one of the guys in our office noted that the container number didn't match anything on our delivery schedule. That wasn't immediately alarming. Things ended up in the worst loading areas occasionally, especially on busy days. We started making calls to figure out where it belonged. While we were doing that, one of my coworkers stopped talking and looked toward the loading area. He thought he had heard something outside. We went out and stood near the container. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then something hit the inside wall. 3 or 4 heavy knocks. We backed away and called security. When they arrived, they opened the container. There was a soldier inside. His hand had been tied behind his back. There was red blood around his nose, and one side of his face was badly bruised. He was conscious, but he looked exhausted. Once they got him out and gave him some water, one of the first things he asked about was the truck. I told him it had already left. For a second, he looked relieved. Then I explained that it hadn't left the installation. I'd given the driver directions to another warehouse farther inside. His entire expression changed. He told security that whoever had been driving the truck had no legitimate reason to be anywhere near the area he had first encountered him. Earlier that afternoon, the soldier had seen the same man behind the storage building. The driver was handling equipment there, even though his delivery had nothing to do with that location. The soldier approached him to find out what he was doing. The man attacked him. He remembered being hit and trying to fight back. After that, things became unclear. When he regained consciousness, his hands were tied and he was inside the container. He had no idea where he was. Security immediately started looking for the tractor. They found it less than a mile away near another warehouse. The cab was empty. Camera footage showed the driver getting out, removing the outboard jacket he had been wearing, taking something from the cab and walking between 2 buildings. After that, cameras lost him. The part of the installation we were in wasn't completely locked down, but movement was restricted while military police searched the area. Doors were secured, people were told to remain in their workspaces, and vehicles leaving the area were checked. Because I had spoken directly to the driver, MPs asked me for a description. I told them everything I could remember: his approximate age, height, clothing, reflective vest. While I was describing him, something occurred to me. I could identify him, but he could identify me too. But stood directly in front of him. One of the MPs told me to stay inside with two of my coworkers while they searched. We waited there about 40 minutes. At some point, an MP came and told us they'd reviewed more security footage. The driver wasn't moving toward an exit. He'd been seen walking back through the warehouse area on foot. That bothered me. Until then, I had assumed he was trying to escape. Apparently, he wasn't. Eventually, they decided to move several of us to another building while the search continued. Two MPs escorted us across the loading area. There were still employees and contractors outside in controlled areas, and as we passed one of the warehouses, I saw a small group of civilian workers standing near some equipment. I barely looked at them. Then, after we'd already passed, something about one of the men bothered me. I stopped and looked back. Reflective vest, work clothes, about the right height. For a moment, I wasn't sure. Then he turned his head. It was him. The strange part was how completely normal he looked. He wasn't crouched behind a vehicle or trying to hide. He was standing beside legitimate workers as if he'd been working with them all afternoon. And if I hadn't spoken to him earlier, I probably would have walked straight past him. Then he noticed me staring. I told the MP beside me that I was almost certain it was a driver. Doors starting toward him. He immediately separated from the workers and began walking away. One of the MPs called for him to stop. He didn't. He made it to the corner of the storage building before he started running. He didn't get far. They caught him near a fenced storage yard without anyone being injured. Despite all the rumors that started almost immediately, there was apparently no terrorism or espionage involved. The driver worked for a company that had legitimate business on the installation. Investigators believed he'd been using legitimate deliveries as covered to steal expensive tools and equipment. He knew the warehouse areas. He knew what certain locations were busy. And most importantly, he knew that if he wore the right clothes, carried the right paperwork, and acted like he belonged there, most people working inside the installation would assume someone at the gate or another warehouse had already verified him. Investigators believed the attack hadn't been planned. After overpowering the soldier, the driver restrained him, hid him inside an empty container. Then he had another problem. He needed to get rid of the container, so he dropped it in our loading area among normal deliveries and drove away. He probably expected it to sit there long enough for him to finish whatever he was doing and leave the installation. Instead, the soldier woke up. The container number wasn't on our schedule, and we heard a knocking. I never learned exactly what charges the driver eventually received, or how much stolen property investigators connected to him, but I did hear that this wasn't his first time on the installation. He'd apparently made legitimate delivery there before, and investigators believe he'd been taking advantage of that access for some times. That detail stayed with me. Before that afternoon, I assumed the difficult part of getting somewhere you weren't supposed to be was sitting through the gate. But this guy didn't sneak through a fence. He didn't come in at night. He entered during normal working hours in a truck belonging to a company people recognized. And once he was inside, the thing protecting him wasn't some elaborate disguise. It was the fact that he looked boring. A reflective vest, a clipboard, a delivery truck. I spoke to him myself. I gave him directions. Then I watched him drive deeper into the installation without thinking anything of it. The soldier inside the container had stayed unconscious for another hour. The driver might have finished what he was doing and driven straight back out. And the next time his truck came through the gate, I don't know if any of us would have looked twice.